In the past few days, this village, Hamstreet in Kent, has been well and truly put on the map by these, the latest set of postage stamps. The stamps commemorate the bicentenary of the Ordnance Survey, and Hamstreet was chosen to show the way that villages and map-making have changed during the past 200 years. Today, we carry out our own survey into the Ordnance Survey. But first, here's News Update. Ordnance Survey maps are perhaps something that we all take for granted as our guide to the British countryside. But to get them to the stage where they're at today, covering the entire country, has taken 200 years of hard work in all kinds of weathers, drawing, mapping out the land all around us. There have been many changes during that time, not only to the way that maps are made, but to the countryside itself. And now the Ordnance Survey is facing perhaps the greatest challenges in its history. As Michael Colley now reports, it all began when the Duke of Richmond sent out an order that the whole of the southeast of England should be mapped and measured.
The year is 1791, and storm clouds are gathering over Europe. Kent fears invasion, and the British Army are worried. 45 years ago, they defeated Bonnie Prince Charlie at Culloden. Since then, they've been using accurate maps of Scotland to keep the peace. But no such detailed maps exist of the rest of the country. And right now, that's causing a few sleepless nights around here on account of the French connection. The French Revolution is underway, and the British are only too aware that the threat from across the water might spill over to the south coast of England. Around tiny hamlets like Hamstreet, military operations begin to map the countryside. It's a lengthy, laborious process using a Ramsden theodolite, problem-free in clear weather, but time-consuming all the same. Metal chains have to be laid out across the countryside to measure fields, tracks, hills, every feature of the landscape. Even London is measured and mapped for military analysis. The village of Woolwich is shown in its context of fields and orchards, vital military information when planning on where to feed and sleep horses and troops in the event of war. Here in Hamstreet, times are hard. With war on the continent, grain prices are on the increase. Farmers are actually quite well off, but their agricultural workers on fixed wages are getting progressively poorer. Stripped by the enclosures of the common land on which to graze their cattle, many will soon be destitute. With the opening of the Royal Military Canal in 1805, on the map as a defensive line just a mile from Hamstreet, villagers are starting to feel safer. The canal improves communication links, as does a new toll road, complete with a toll house at the village cross. Indeed, by the early 19th century, Hamstreet even had a daily post. Life in the village was changing faster than ever, but the changes then were nothing compared with the changes that both Hamstreet and the Ordnance Survey would experience in the years ahead. By the time the map of 1906 was printed, considerable changes had occurred. The railway had been built, and Ordnance Survey maps were showing contours and footpaths. The rural leisure industry was about to take off. But to get Britain to that point, a revolution in map-making had taken place, and partly to do with this, the railway. No longer was military mapping the only preoccupation of the Ordnance Survey. Instead, there was now a demand for clearer, fine detail maps for Britain's expanding industries, the railways and their engineers being one example. The Ordnance Survey responded to that demand, producing 25 inches to the mile maps and 10 feet to the mile for dense urban areas. Mapping became a basic requirement for progress and development in the 19th century. With the arrival of the train, the pace of change in rural life increased. Villages became less isolated. Ideas and goods started to move around the country, but the canals became less important and were neglected. Agriculture was going through a period of relative prosperity, and although farm wages were far behind industrial ones, people began to travel, if only on day trips.
August bank holiday was the main one of the year. Just your family used to go on a trip, sometimes if it was possible to get to Dymchurch, which wasn't often, and that was mostly a horse and wagon ride. But of course you could go by train to Margate, or Hastings, so they were the two most likely places to go.
As Hamstreet's villagers started venturing out, the Ordnance Survey's Director-General, Sir Charles Close, was considering the potential for rural leisure maps. But 1914 halted any commercial spin-offs for the Ordnance Survey, as the countryside was put on a war footing and the organisation itself returned to its military roots, producing maps of battlefields, like this one of Lens in France, British trenches in red, Germans in blue. As war ended, Hamstreet was still a quiet country village, but even rural life was changing. Cycling and rambling became popular outdoor activities. Increasing quantities of farmland were opened up for leisure use. Camping took off in a big way. And related to that, so did a whole new area of the Ordnance Survey's work, Sir Charles Close's vision of commercial maps to meet the growing leisure market. But the attractive covers hid a truth about the British countryside. It was in crisis. Cheap imports from the Empire were destroying British farming. A cutback in government funding was starting to hit the Ordnance Survey too.
The country had invested an enormous sum of money in arriving at the coverage at these large scales which it had by the end of the 19th century. Now, instead of continuously bringing it up to date by continuous revision, they had a system of intermediate revisions. The intermediate revisions were allowed to lapse, and by the 1930s, the large-scale topographical database of the country was completely out of date, to the extent that local authorities were trying to make their own plans for their own purposes.
It took the government until the mid-1930s to realise that things were going badly wrong. They gave the Ordnance Survey more money, and a complete remapping of Britain began, a job which would take some 40 years, and which would involve putting up 6,500 of these famous trig points on the tops of hills, allowing surveyors to see and measure from one high point to another.
But almost before they could get started, the country was plunged into war once more, this time with an even more significant effect on the landscape. The famous Land Army was mobilised in the fight to feed the nation, and even London's parks were dug up. The Ordnance Survey itself suffered a direct hit on its Southampton headquarters.
Once again, Hamstreet and Kent became vulnerable to enemy attack. The Home Guard watched over the precious telephone exchange night and day. Pillboxes were built along the canal and in the village. Even the bridge was mined. The local women ran a forces canteen and even held bandage rolling sessions. And once again, maps became invaluable as a military tool.
Back in peacetime, another era starts. 1959, and Hamstreet has grown. The maps show the countryside around southeast England as being suddenly full of large villages, gradually turning into commuter land. Lifestyles were changing. Britain was moving into the swinging 60s. The Ordnance Survey got a new headquarters, soon lost its official military connections, and became an independent government agency. Now in 1991, the Ordnance Survey is producing metric maps, 2 centimetres to the kilometre rather than 1 inch to the mile. The village of Hamstreet has changed too, from the quiet rural village it was earlier this century.
Over the past 30 years, the population of Hamstreet has more than doubled, and there's now a new village hall, but many of the local shops have gone. For example, there's now no butchers, and the bakery in Hamstreet since the 1840s has also gone. It's now a private house. The village street is now so busy, there's going to be a bypass, with all the chances of development around it.
Not everyone's keen on the way this English village has developed. Has the cost of change to the 1990s way of life been too great?
Where you would look onto a green area, you now look onto a small development of houses, and not always in the design of our choice. We have a lot of disagreements with the local council. We would like to have tried to have kept more to the village style. A lot of the modern houses have got no content of the local original village.
One pressure on the horizon for Hamstreet is the Channel Tunnel development 12 miles away. It's a big project for the Ordnance Survey too, continually updating their central maps using digital information and electronic theodolites.
Repeat feature code 2 on me.
Meanwhile, what of Hamstreet and its future? The Post Office have issued a set of stamps showing this English village past and present. The chances are that if they were to issue a fifth stamp showing Hamstreet in the future, it would be noticeably different.
Already a bypass is planned, due to open at the end of next year. Planning consent's been granted for 2 new housing developments, with 2 more under discussion. And after that,
We're 7 miles from Ashford, but with the building that's proposed, we could almost in long term be marrying up with Ashford, would be very sad. All the people that live in the village want to live as village life, so to speak. If you marry up to the town, you then become part of the town.
Do you think Hamstreet would exist then at all?
I wouldn't think so. It's a very close-knit community now. We have a lot of social gatherings. If you were much larger, you would lose the content of that, which would be very sad.
200 years ago, Hamstreet merely had Napoleon to worry about, and the Ordnance Survey was only just starting. Now both are having to fight to retain their identity against outside pressures. We can only wonder whether they'll exist in another 200 years.
Michael Colley reporting on Britain's official map makers. Well, let's turn now to the weather maps and find out what the forecast is going to be for the week ahead. Here's the Countryfile weather news.